They thought he was nothing but a ragged old farmer with a limp, an easy target for their laughter. The bikers mocked his boots, his patched flannel, even tipped over his apples in front of the whole town. But while the crowd watched in uneasy silence, one man in uniform stepped forward and spoke a name no one expected. Commander Holt. Suddenly, the quiet old man wasn't just a farmer. He was someone who had once led missions overseas, a Navy SEAL who never bragged, never asked for credit. What happens when the loudest men in the room realized the one they mocked was the most dangerous of them all? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The morning began quietly, as most did in Stonefield, Vermont. The old cobblestone square held its familiar arrangement of stalls, wooden tables polished by years of weather and use. Vendors moved slowly, not in a rush, but with the kind of rhythm that comes from repetition, from knowing exactly how many minutes it takes to lay out the fruit, sweep away the leaves, and adjust the chalk signs that listed the day's prices. The autumn air was cool and damp, carrying with it the scent of wet earth from the fields just beyond town. The first sound were not voices, but the scrape of wooden crates against stone. An old pickup rolled into the square and stopped near the far edge, away from the flower stalls and the bakery's bright umbrellas. The driver's door creaked open, and a man climbed down, his movements careful but steady. He wore boots whose leather had gone soft with age, a flannel shirt faded from countless washes, and a cap that had once been dark blue but was now bleached by years of sun. His beard was short, gray threaded with white, and his eyes seemed to look past the square itself, focused on the simple task of unloading. One by one, he set down crates of produce: apples, potatoes, late-season squash. Each crate landed with solid weight, arranged in neat rows that formed the foundation of his stall. He moved with the discipline of someone used to a task that needed doing regardless of whether anyone was watching. There was no wasted motion, no hurry, and no pause for show. Other vendors greeted him in their ways, small nods and murmured good mornings. He returned the gestures with brief acknowledgement, nothing more. He was a man of few words, the kind whose presence was marked more by silence than by chatter. Some knew him as Holt, others just as a farmer who came each Saturday to sell what his land produced. Few asked questions, and fewer received answers beyond a quiet "thank you" when coins crossed the table. As the morning stretched, townsfolk began arriving. Young mothers with children tugging at their sleeves, retirees carrying cloth bags, the occasional tourist snapping pictures of pumpkins stacked in perfect pyramids. The square filled with a hum of voices and the shuffle of footsteps. A musician sat up near the fountain, tuning a guitar that would later spill soft notes across the crowd. The farmer continued his work without hurry. He lifted apples from a crate, polished them lightly on his sleeve, and set them in rows where the skin caught the pale morning sun. He stacked potatoes in burlap sacks, tied with practiced knots. The squash, mottled green and orange, he arranged like a harvest display, though he seemed not to notice the pattern he created. A boy wandered up, no older than 10, watching the farmer's hands. The boy's mother stood a few feet away, comparing prices at another stall. The farmer didn't speak, but slid a smaller apple across the table toward the boy. The boy looked surprised, then smiled, taking the gift without a word. The farmer's eyes softened briefly, then returned his work as though nothing had happened. Around him, the market's rhythm deepened. The smell of fresh bread rose from the bakery stall, mingling with the earthy scent of root vegetables. Voices called out prices. Laughter rose and fell. The sound of the bell from the church tower marked the hour. Amid it all, the farmer's stall remained quiet, steady, an island of silence in the market's growing noise. For those who noticed, there was something unusual in the way he carried himself. His posture was straight, not with arrogance, but with a discipline that seemed unshaken by age. His hands, though calloused, moved with precision rather than clumsiness. People sometimes whispered that he had not always been just a farmer, that his life before Stonefield had been marked by things he never spoke of. But such thoughts faded easily in the bustle of the market, where produce and bread mattered more than old stories. The morning passed in this steady rhythm. Coins clinked into jars, bags filled, and the square grew louder. Through it all, the farmer remained as he had begun, quiet, methodical, working as if the entire market was only background noise to the task at hand. It was a calm no one thought much about then, not knowing how quickly that calm would be tested. The calm of the market was a fragile thing, built on the rhythm of footsteps and the soft chatter of neighbors who knew one another by name. It held steady until the sound came, low at first, then growing louder as it approached. The rumble of engines rolled over the cobblestones like distant thunder. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and the easy music of the guitar near the fountain stopped mid-strum. From afar into Main Street, a line of motorcycles came into view. Chrome caught the pale sunlight, handlebars wide, exhaust pipes glinting. The engines were not content to idle. They snarled and echoed off the brick fronts of the old buildings, turning the square into a chamber that magnified their presence. Children covered their ears. Some adults frowned but said nothing. The machines slowed only slightly as they entered, circling the fountain once before parking in a row that claimed more space than necessary. Leather jackets, patches stitched on with symbols no one cared to interpret, black boots that struck the cobblestones with deliberate force. The riders dismounted with the confidence of men who expected attention. Their laughter was sharp, loud enough to cut through whatever remained of the morning calm. A few lit cigarettes, the smoke curling into the autumn air, while others stretched as though the market were theirs to occupy. The farmer did not look up. His hands continued their steady work, moving potatoes from sack to table, smoothing the burlap as if the rumble of engines and the sudden shift in the square had not happened. Around him, however, people had grown still. Mothers ushered children closer, some slipping away toward quieter streets. The sheriff, leaning against his truck near the bakery, shifted his weight but made no move. He knew the group, visitors from the next county who liked to remind small towns of their presence. The bikers walked slowly, deliberately, as though inspecting what the market had to offer. They passed a flower stall, mocking the scent of lilacs in exaggerated tones. They paused at the bakery, making a show of tasting samples without paying, their laughter swelling at the discomfort of the woman behind the counter. Coins remained firmly in their pockets. When they reached the far corner, their eyes settled on the farmer's stall. It was not the produce that drew them, but the man behind it, quiet, older, standing firm in a place where others shifted uneasily under their gaze. They slowed, forming a loose circle near his table. One of them nudged another, pointing at the patched jacket he wore, its elbows frayed, its shoulders sun-bleached. Their laughter rose again, this time sharper, directed not at flowers or bread, but at the man who had so far refused to look up. The sound of their mockery carried across the square, pulling eyes that would rather not watch. Some shook their heads, others muttered under their breath. No one intervened. The weight of the engine still hung in the air, and with it, the understanding that these men enjoyed the discomfort they caused. The farmer reached for an apple, polishing it slowly against the sleeve. His silence seemed deliberate now, not ignorance but choice, as if he had already decided that their noise did not deserve to disturb the work of his hands. It was a decision that unsettled them more than any reply might have. The laughter did not stop, but beneath it ran a current of irritation, the first ripple in what would soon become something more. One of the bikers leaned on the edge of the farmer's stall, his leather jacket creaking as he folded his arms. His eyes traveled slowly from the crates of apples to the man arranging them, pausing on the scuffed boots that had seen more fields and sidewalks. A smirk formed, and he let his voice rise just enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "Look at this," he said, tilting his chin toward his friends. "Scarecrow's running a produce shop now." The words carried easily through the air, louder than the ordinary market noise. A few of the bikers laughed, their voices coarse and mocking, echoing against the brick storefronts. The label stuck to the air, crude and sharp, meant to sting. Some onlookers lowered their eyes, unwilling to witness what was coming next. Others watched with a kind of guilty curiosity, waiting to see if the old man would bristle or push back. The farmer did not. He set the apple carefully into the row, aligning it with the others so their skins reflected the faint sunlight like polished glass. His hands moved without tremor, deliberate and calm. He didn't meet their eyes, didn't defend himself, didn't speak. To the bikers, this silence looked like weakness. To anyone paying closer attention, it was something else entirely. The one who had spoken leaned closer, tapping a finger against the edge of the stall. You hear me, old man? Or are those ears of yours filled with straw, too? His friends chuckled again, nudging each other, feeding on the performance. They wanted reaction, a flash of anger, some sign that their mockery had landed, but still the farmer's eyes stayed on his work. He adjusted a sack of potatoes, straightening it so it wouldn't slump, then brushed a smear of dirt from the table. He moved as though no one stood there, as though their noise was just another sound in the morning air, like the crows that sometimes circled the fields. His calm unsettled them, though they disguised it with louder laughter. Across the square, the boy who had received an apple earlier tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Why are they calling him that?" he whispered. She hushed him quickly, her eyes darting between the bikers and the sheriff leaning against his truck. The sheriff shifted, but didn't approach. Small towns often measure the cost of interference, and for now, he let the scene unfold. The biker closest to the stall picked up an apple without asking, rolling it in his palm as though weighing its worth. "These even real?" he jeered. "Looks like something you'd feed pigs." He tossed it back onto the table, the fruit bouncing once before settling among the others. The farmer's hand reached out, steady, placing it back into its row. No complaint, no raised voice. The silence stretched until it was almost uncomfortable. A few of the bikers grew restless, drumming fingers on the stall, pacing with short steps. The man who had started the mocking leaned back, finally, shaking his head. "Scarecrow," he repeated, louder this time, as though the word alone could force a reaction. But none came. The farmer's eyes lifted just once, briefly, not toward the speaker but past him, scanning the square as if to check the weather or mark the time of day. The gaze lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough to leave the loudest of the bikers oddly unsettled. He masked it with another laugh, but his voice didn't carry the same confidence. What the crowd saw that morning was nothing more than an old man ignoring insults. What they missed was the discipline behind that silence, the years of practice it took to hold steady under pressure. The bikers thought they had found an easy target, a man to ridicule in front of others. They didn't realize that the stillness they mocked was the very thing they should have feared. The laughter lingered in the square long after the insult was spoken, rising and falling like a challenge tossed into the morning air. The farmer, standing at his stall, did not meet it with words. Instead, he bent slightly, reached into a crate, and lifted another apple. Its skin was mottled red and green, the kind of imperfect beauty that marked fruit grown in real soil rather than factory rows. He rubbed it against the sleeve of his faded flannel, polishing it until the dullness gave way to a soft shine, then placed it carefully beside the others. His hands moved with the patience of someone who had done this countless times before, as though the weight of the apple and the order of the row mattered more than anything else happening around him. The bikers stood restless, waiting for some response that never came. One of them muttered something under his breath. Another laughed too loudly, but the man they mocked seemed to treat them as nothing more than wind against the window. He adjusted a basket of potatoes, smoothing the burlap sack beneath it so it sat evenly. He stacked carrots in a neat line, their tops still damp with dew. Each action was slow, unhurried, as if he were alone in his field rather than surrounded by eyes waiting to see what he would do. A woman buying bread across the square glanced over, her brows furrowed. She had known him for years in passing, had bought apples from him each season. She whispered to her friend, "He never says much." The friend nodded, eyes on the bikers who were shifting from amusement to irritation. For them, silence was not satisfying. It was unnerving. The farmer lifted a crate of squash next, his shoulders flexing under the weight. The muscles in his arms moved with the quiet efficiency of habit. He set the crate down gently, as though even vegetables deserved respect. His face betrayed nothing, no anger, no embarrassment, no trace of the sting they tried to inflict. He kept his eyes low, focused on the work, and the longer he remained calm, the more the sound of their laughter seemed to ring hollow. Children clung closer to their parents. A young couple, arms full of flowers, paused by the fountain to watch. The sheriff, still leaning on his truck, narrowed his eyes but stayed put. It was as though everyone waited for the silence to break, for the old man to finally rise to the bait. But it never came. One of the bikers, taller than the rest, leaned closer to the stall, trying to force a reaction. "You deaf, old man," he barked, his voice sharp. The farmer straightened slowly, lifting his gaze just enough to measure the weight of the words. He said nothing. He picked up another apple, polished it with the same steady motion, and set it in line. The biker's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, unsettled by the lack of resistance, then returned with forced bravado. It wasn't pride that kept the farmer quiet, nor fear. It was something practiced, something earned long before he ever stood behind a market stall. His silence was not submission. It was control. The crowd couldn't name it, but they felt it in the space between the laughter and the soft sound it produced being arranged, in the way his hand stayed steady when most men's would have trembled. The market carried on around them, though thinner now, the voices of vendors muted, the guitar near the fountain still silent. In that square, the balance had shifted. The bikers tried to fill the air with noise, but it was the quiet of the farmer's work that drew every eye. Each apple placed, each crate adjusted, was louder than any insult. The square was full now, voices mingling with the smells of bread and roasted coffee. Yet the center of attention had shifted unmistakably to the quiet stall at the far end. The laughter of the bikers carried across the cobblestones, sharp and mocking, louder than the ordinary rhythms of buying and selling. People who had been comparing the prices of pears or choosing bouquets now found themselves pausing, glancing sideways, pretending to fuss with their bags while their eyes lingered on the old farmer and the men surrounding him. Some were amused in the way crowds often are when spectacle breaks through routine. A group of teenagers loitering by the fountain smirked at one another, whispering as though the scene was free entertainment provided for their morning. They nudged each other each time the bikers' voices rose, as if waiting for the farmer to finally snap and give them a story to repeat later. Others laughed softly under their breath, not cruel but detached, comforted by the fact that the mockery was aimed at someone else and not at them. But there were more who felt unease settling in, though they tried not to show it. A mother tugged her child closer, her smile fixed too tightly as she urged the boy to keep walking toward the bakery. An elderly man in a wool coat lingered by the cheese stall, his lips pressed into a thin line, the discomfort in his eyes betraying the stillness of his posture. The florist, standing behind her buckets of roses and lilies, wrung her hands in her apron but said nothing, her gaze darting between the farmer's silence and the bikers' jeering faces. The sheriff's presence by his truck gave some comfort, but his lack of movement also sent a message. He watched with narrowed eyes, arms crossed, his hat tilted low, but he didn't step forward. In a small town, there was always a line between maintaining order and escalating it, and for now he seemed content to let the moment run its course. His choice told the others that interference was risky, and so the silence of authority spread into the silence of the crowd. A few vendors whispered among themselves. "Why doesn't he say anything?" one asked, stacking loaves of bread with nervous hands. Another shrugged. "That's just Holt. Never says much. Always keeps to himself." The words held no malice, just resignation, as though they had long ago accepted his quiet presence without asking what lay behind it. The longer the scene stretched, the heavier the unease became. The farmer's silence seemed to magnify the biker's noise, turning each insult into something harsher, simply because it echoed against restraint. The townsfolk shifted their weight, glanced at one another, and yet none of them stepped forward. Each person told themselves a reason. Someone else would intervene. The sheriff was watching. Perhaps the man didn't mind as much as it seemed. Beneath those reasons lay something simpler. Fear of standing out. Fear of drawing the bikers' attention onto themselves. And so they remained on the edges, watching as though from behind glass. The children sensed it too, their small hands gripping their parents more tightly, their wide eyes fixed on the stall, where apples were still being arranged in calm, steady rows. The laughter of the bikers filled the space, but the silence of the onlookers was just as loud, a silence built from hesitation, caution, and the quiet calculation of people who had chosen to remain still. The boy stood behind a table stacked with jars of honey, his hands sticky from arranging them in neat rows, as his mother had taught him. He was 15, old enough to know when something wasn't right, but still young enough to ask questions others kept to themselves. His eyes had been drawn again and again to the far end of the square, where the old farmer worked quietly beneath the weight of laughter that didn't belong in the market. He shifted his feet, glancing at his mother, who was busy counting out change for a customer. When the woman left, he leaned closer, lowering his voice. Why doesn't he say anything back? His mother shook her head quickly, her eyes flicking to the stall in question. Don't get involved, she whispered, straightening a stack of brown paper bags. It's not our place. But her hands trembled slightly as she worked, betraying the calmness of her words. The boy returned his gaze to the scene. The bikers were loud, their leather jackets creaking as they moved, their boots heavy on the cobblestones. They circled the farmer's stand like wolves sniffing at a meal, their laughter sharp, their words mean. The farmer, though, remained steady. His hands moved over apples and potatoes, as if the men weren't there at all. Each motion was precise, almost deliberate, as though arranging produce was more important than answering to mockery. To the boy, that silence seemed strange, even wrong. He had seen men tease before at school, had watched bullies push smaller kids into lockers, demanding reaction. Silence there was weakness, the kind that invited more jeers. But this silence felt different, heavier somehow, like a stone that would not be moved no matter how hard it was pushed. The boy tilted his head, studying the farmer's face. There was no fear in his expression, no shame, no hint of defeat. Just focus, calm, the same look his grandfather had worn when mending fences or fixing broken tools. Still, the boy's chest tightened with unease. Why doesn't anyone stop them? He asked again, this time barely more than a breath. His mother didn't answer. She busied herself with another customer, her shoulders stiff. Around the market, he saw others pretending to shop while sneaking glances at the commotion. The sheriff stood nearby, arms crossed, unmoving. The florist rearranged her lilies for the third time, though none had sold. Everyone watched, no one spoke. The boy's concern deepened, pressing against him like a weight. He imagined what it would feel like to stand in that silence, surrounded by laughter that wasn't laughter at all. He imagined how heavy it must be to keep working as though nothing had changed. He wanted to step forward, to say something, but his throat tightened at the thought. He was only 15, just a helper at his mother's stall. The bikers were men, loud and strong, and the sheriff's stillness seemed to declare that this was not a fight anyone else wanted. So the boy remained where he was, whispering questions in the air that no one would answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the farmer, waiting for something, anything, that would explain the silence. And though he could not know it yet, the answer would come in time, not with words shouted across a market, but with truths carried quietly, waiting for the moment they were needed most. The laughter shifted as the bikers found new angles to sharpen their words. It wasn't enough to call him Scarecrow anymore. They leaned closer now, their voices rising so that everyone in the market could hear, turning the farmer into the centerpiece of the show he hadn't asked before men. One of them pointed at his boots, the cracked leather dulled with years of use. Look at those things, he jeered. Must have been bought back when gas was 20 cents a gallon. Another chimed in, tapping the shoulder of the man beside him. That jacket's seen better days. My old man used to patch tires with scraps that looked better than that. The group erupted into forced laughter, the kind that fed on itself, swelling louder with each new insult. Their attention circled him like hounds testing a fence, probing for weakness. They wanted the twitch of anger, the snap of pride, the smallest sign they'd landed their blows. Instead, they got the same quiet rhythm of a man setting apples into careful rows. The limp was next. One biker noticed the way the farmer shifted his weight when he walked, the brief hitch in his step as he carried a crate from the truck to the table. He seized on it instantly. Careful there, old man, he said, mocking concern dripping from his voice. Don't want to trip over your own feet. Might break a hip before you sell a single squash. Another barked out laughter, slapping his thigh, adding, probably hurt himself falling off a tractor. The insult spilled across the square, bouncing off the walls of the bakery and the flower shop, reaching ears that didn't want to hear them. Some of the onlookers grimaced, others looked away, but still no one stepped forward. The sheriff stayed at his post, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, but his boots remained planted. The florist's hands trembled as she wrapped a bouquet, while a grocer rearranged apples just to avoid watching what was already unfolding. Through it all, the farmer never lifted his head. His movements didn't falter. He reached for another basket, adjusted it so it sat straight on the table, and brushed away the dirt that had fallen from the produce. His silence was unbroken, his breathing calm, as if the jeers were no more than leaves rustling in a breeze. His face, weathered by sun and years of labor, gave nothing back to them. It might have been carved from stone, lined with age but firm, unyielding. To the bikers, that stillness only made them louder. They mocked the deep lines etched across his forehead, the skin brown from countless days under the sun. "You see that face?" one of them called. "Looks like he's been left out in the fields since the Depression." Another leaned in close enough that the smell of smoke clung to the stall. "But you've never seen a razor in 10 years, have you?" The farmer lifted a potato from the crate, brushing off the dirt, and set it down as carefully as he had with the apples. His hands didn't tremble. His shoulders didn't hunch. He moved as though none of it mattered, as though the work before him outweighed the noise around him. And yet, for those who truly watched, there was something different in his silence now. Not weakness, not fear, but control. A restraint that held firm no matter how the bikers tried to shake it. The boy at the honey stall stared, trying to understand. The sheriff's eyes narrowed further, recognition flickering across his face, though he still said nothing. The insults kept coming, louder, harsher, aimed at every visible imperfection the bikers thought they could exploit. But the farmer's calm held. Each apple placed, each crate adjusted, each quiet motion seemed to absorb their noise and return nothing back. And in that silence, there was a strength no one yet dared to name. She came into the square carrying 2 baskets, one hooked in the crook of her arm and the other balanced against her hip. The smell of fresh bread followed her, still warm from the oven, wrapped in linen to keep the heat. She had her father's eyes, dark and steady, though her expression carried more fire than his ever showed. People greeted her as she passed, the grocer with a nod, the florist with a quick wave, but she barely paused, her gaze fixed on the far end of the market where she knew she'd find him. At first, she thought it was the ordinary crowd that gathered near his stall, customers waiting for apples or potatoes. But as she drew closer, she heard the laughter, sharp and cutting, voices raised not in conversation but in mockery. She slowed, her steps measured, the basket shifting against her arms. The sight met her like a blow. Her father standing behind his table, arranging produce with calm, deliberate motions, while the men in leather circled him like crows. Their laughter was too loud, their words pointed. She saw one of them nudge another and point at her father's jacket, its shoulders patched neatly with fabric she herself had sewn. Her jaw tightened until her teeth ached. She wanted to set the baskets down, to march straight up and demand they leave him alone. The urge burned in her chest, hot and insistent. But when she looked at her father's face, the fire dimmed into something else. He was calm, his eyes lowered, his hands steady as he placed another apple in line with the others. The laughter rolled over him without breaking his rhythm. It wasn't weakness. She knew that look. It was the same expression he wore when storms battered the fields, when machinery broke down at the worst possible moment, when bills piled high on the table. It was a look of endurance, of choosing silence because silence gave him control. She took a slow breath and followed his lead. Without a word, she moved behind the stall, sliding the baskets of bread onto the table. She untied the linens and began arranging the loaves beside the vegetables. Her movements echoed his, steady, precise, deliberate. She did not meet the biker's eyes, though she felt them shift toward her. Their laughter faltered for a heartbeat, curiosity breaking through their cruelty. One of them muttered something under his breath, a crude remark meant to sting, but she ignored it. She set another loaf down, adjusted it, then smoothed the cloth beneath it. A woman at a nearby stall watched with a kind of cautious admiration. The sheriff, still leaning on his truck, adjusted his stance, the brim of his hat hiding his eyes. The boy at the honey stall leaned forward, whispering something to his mother. The market seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the daughter would break the silence her father had chosen. But she did not. She mirrored him instead, her presence at his side doubling the weight of his quiet defiance. Together they worked, arranging bread and vegetables as if the bikers were invisible, as if the jeers and laughter were nothing more than the clatter of hooves on a distant road. The bikers grew louder, unsettled by the lack of reaction. By the way, their noise seemed to vanish into the calm rhythm of father and daughter. Yet neither lifted their eyes, neither offered a word. The only answer they gave was a steady placement of apples and loaves, an unspoken language stronger than any reply could have been. The air in the square had grown tense, the kind of stillness that settles when storm is on its way, but hasn't yet broken. The farmer and his daughter worked side by side, their hands steady, their silence unbroken, while the bikers prowled around the stall, looking for new ways to provoke. Their laughter had begun to ring hollow, but rather than fade, it sharpened, twisting into something meaner. The one who had been watching most closely, a tall man with scar across his cheek, stepped forward and planted his boot against the leg of a wooden crate. Without warning, he gave a shove. The crate tipped, the wood scraping against the cobblestones before crashing onto its side. Apples spilled out in every direction, bouncing and rolling across the uneven stones. Some split open, their flesh exposed, juice marking the ground in sticky streaks. Children gasped, a dog barked, and the laughter of the bikers rose high, filling the square. They clapped each other on the shoulders, grinning at the mess as though they had accomplished something grand. The farmer didn't flinch. He watched the fruit scatter, his eyes steady, his body unmoving for a long moment. His daughter's jaw tightened again, her hands clenched at her sides, but she looked at him first. He bent slowly, the movement marked by the hitch in his step, and reached for the nearest apple. He picked it up carefully, brushed away the dust, and placed it back into the crate. Then he reached for another. His silence was heavier now, more deliberate than before, and it pressed against the noise around him like a weight the bikers couldn't lift. The daughter knelt beside him, gathering apples into her apron, placing them back in the crate one by one. Her movements were sharp, quick, but she said nothing. Together, they worked while the men laughed above them, their boots occasionally nudging fruit further away, sending it skittering across the square. Each time, the farmer followed calmly, bending, lifting, returning the apples to their place. Onlookers stood frozen in uneasy lines. A grocer muttered under his breath, "That's enough," but didn't step forward. The sheriff shifted again, his hand brushing the brim of his hat, his eyes fixed on the biker who had shoved the crate. Still, he stayed where he was, waiting, calculating. The boy at the honey stall leaned so far forward, he nearly knocked over a jar, whispering urgently to his mother, "Why won't he stop them?" She pulled him back gently, her lips pressed in, her eyes full of worry. The biker's laughter echoed, but there was something in the farmer's stillness that began to unsettle the edges of their fun. His refusal to rise, his quiet gathering of what they had scattered, created a contrast that stripped the act of its power. Each apple returned to the crate was like a quiet answer, a steady declaration that the mess they made could not shake him. The daughter's presence beside him, her silent strength reinforcing his, deepened the unease. The laughter continued, but it carried a forced edge now, as though they were trying to convince themselves the scene still belonged to them. The square itself seemed to lean closer, the rhythm of the market broken but not gone, waiting for what would come next. The farmer straightened at last, the crate half filled again, his face calm, his eyes unreadable. He stood not as a man defeated, but as one who had chosen not to be moved. And though no one knew it yet, the storm that began with a tipped crate had set something in motion that laughter alone would not be able to drown out. The laughter of the bikers still rang across the square, bouncing off the stone walls of the old buildings. But for Farmer it might as well have been nothing more than wind. He knelt beside the overturned crate, his knees pressing against the cobblestones, the hitch in his step becoming more obvious as he lowered himself slowly, deliberately. The apples lay scattered in every direction, rolling into cracks, some resting at the boots of those who watched. Juice glistened on the ground where a few had split open, their sweetness mixing with dust. His hands moved with the same steadiness that had carried him through the morning. He picked up one apple, wiped it gently against the sleeve of his flannel, and placed it back into the crate. Then another and another. Each fruit returned to its place with a kind of quiet order, as though restoring what had been broken was more important than acknowledging who had broken it. The bikers leaned back, arms crossed, grins still wide, but there was a hesitation in their voices now. One of them muttered something crude about old man chores, but the words didn't land with the same force. the silence of the farmer as he worked pressed against them, dulling the edges of their jeers. It was a silence that refused to yield, a silence that gave no ground. His daughter crouched beside him, apron spread open to hold the apples she gathered from further away. She moved faster, sharper, her jaw tight, her hands quick, but she followed his rhythm. Not once did she speak. She understood, as she always had, that his quiet was not weakness but choice. And so she chose it too, matching his silence with her own. Around them, the market had stilled. The boy at the honey stall watched with wide eyes, his breath caught in his chest. His mother tugged his sleeve, urging him to look away, but he couldn't. The sheriff remained by his truck, unreadable, his hat low over his brow. Vendors who had been mid-sale stood frozen, coins and produce left in their hands. The entire square seemed to move only when the farmer's hands moved, each apple placed back into the crate marking time. One by one, the scattered pieces of fruit returned to their order. The crate, once emptied of its dignity, began to fill again. The farmer lifted it with a grunt, the muscles in his arms tightening beneath his sleeves. He set it upright against the table, steadying it with care, and continued gathering until the last apple was reclaimed. Not a single word passed his lips. The laughter had thinned by then. A few of the bikers still smirked, but their noise had dulled, replaced by the uneasy weight of silence that belonged to someone else entirely. The farmer had not raised his voice, had not even looked at them directly, but he had reclaimed more than his apples. He had reclaimed the square itself, bending it back toward calm without ever demanding it. When the last apple was set into place, he straightened, dusted his hands against his thighs, and reached for the next task. Stacking loaves, adjusting potatoes, moving forward as though nothing had been lost at all. His silence remained, unbroken and steady, the kind that made even laughter feel small. The market seemed to breathe differently after the crate was righted. Conversations that had faltered began to pick up again, though quieter than before, cautious as though the weight of what just happened still pressed against the square. The farmer moved with the same calm, steady hands, his daughter beside him, both of them silent. The bikers lingered, their laughter losing its sharp edge, tried to recover performance they had started. Yet for every word they threw out, the farmer's lack of response drained its strength. Near the edge of the square, an older shopkeeper stood in the doorway of his store. He had watched the entire scene unfold from behind the glass at first, but now he stepped outside, leaning against the doorframe. His hair was white, his apron dusted with flour from the loaves cooling on his counter. He was not a man who spoke often, but the lines on his face carried a memory of years lived, and his voice held the weight of someone who had seen more than most. He looked at the bikers for a long moment, then spoke, not loudly but with enough force to carry across the tense air. "Careful, boys," he muttered, his voice rough but steady. "You don't know who you're playing with." The words cut differently than any of the jeers. They were not shouted, not theatrical. They were quiet, measured, and yet they landed with more weight than all the laughter that had filled the square. Some of the onlookers turned toward him, surprise flickering in their eyes. The bikers shifted, their grins tightening, uncertain whether to laugh off the warning or take it seriously. One of them sneered, lifting his chin. "And who exactly do you think this old scarecrow is?" His voice carried bravado, but there was a trace of unease beneath it, a need to mask the ripple of doubt the shopkeeper's words had sparked. The old man didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply folded his arms and leaned heavier against the doorframe, his gaze steady, unwavering. Those who knew him understood he wasn't the type to waste words. If he had spoken, it was because he meant every syllable. The farmer gave no sign that he had heard the warning. His hands continued their work, turning potatoes so their skins faced outward, arranging bread so that the loaves sat neatly in rows. His daughter caught the faintest flicker of something in his expression, not a smile but a recognition of the voice that had spoken. Still, he said nothing. The market hushed again, the weight of the words settling over the square. The sheriff straightened slightly near his truck, though he remained silent, letting the moment hang. The boy at the honey stall leaned toward his mother, whispering, "What did he mean?" But she only shook her head, eyes fixed on the farmer. The bikers exchanged looks, their laughter not quite returning. One of them muttered under his breath, as though to reassure the others, but the sound was thin. The warning had planted itself among them, unwelcome and persistent. For the first time that morning, it was not just the silence of the farmer that unsettled them, but the suggestion that his quiet might not be born of weakness at all. The older shopkeeper returned to his doorway, his arms still folded, his eyes never leaving the stall. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The silence he left behind carried its own kind of gravity, one the bikers could not easily laugh away. The laughter had grown thin, and the old shopkeeper's warning still hung in the air like smoke that would not clear. The bikers stood restless now, shifting their weight, their voices louder than necessary as to try and convince both themselves and the crowd that nothing had changed. But it had. The balance of the morning had shifted, and they felt it. The farmer's silence had endured longer than they expected, longer than most men could stand, and each minute of calm seemed to turn their jeers into echoes of their own impatience. One of them, broad-shouldered and restless, finally stepped closer. He had been quieter than the others until now, his presence marked more by the way he towered over the stall than by any words he had spoken. But something in him cracked under the weight of that quiet endurance. He slammed his fist down on the wooden table with a force that rattled the jars and shook the apples in their rows. The sound echoed across the square, breaking through the murmurs of the onlookers like a hammer striking an anvil. "Speak up, old man," he barked, his face twisted with frustration. "Or are you just a coward hiding behind your vegetables?" His voice carried the anger of someone who needed the upper hand, someone who had found himself unsettled by the very thing he mocked. The farmer did not flinch. The table trembled beneath the blow, but his hand stayed steady. He lifted one of the apples that had rolled, inspected it calmly, and placed it back into line. His silence was his reply, a refusal to bend to the force meant to shake him. The biker's face darkened, his lips curling in a sneer. He pounded the table again, harder this time, the sound making a child cry out somewhere in the crowd. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he demanded, his voice sharp and raw. "Say something, or admit you've got nothing in you but air." Around them, the square had frozen. The florist clutched her apron, eyes wide. The boy at the honey stall stood rigid, his knuckles white around the edge of the table. His mother pulled him closer, whispering for him not to stare, but he couldn't look away. The sheriff's hand hovered near his belt, though he still did not step forward, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed. Everyone waited, breath held, for the silence to finally break. But the farmer only adjusted his stance, his limp evident as he shifted his weight. He straightened one of the baskets that had tipped slightly from the pounding, smoothing the burlap beneath it, and continued his work. His daughter stood at his side, her face tight with anger she fought to contain, her eyes flashing toward the biker, but never giving him the satisfaction of a word. The biker leaned closer, his breath hot with smoke and defiance. "Coward," he spat. The word was meant to pierce, to drag the man out of his silence and into a fight. But it fell into the same quiet well that had swallowed all the others. The farmer's calm absorbed it, returned nothing, and in that refusal, the insult became hollow. The stall stood steady again, the apples lined, the bread arranged, the vegetables placed with care. The farmer's silence did not waver, and in the space between the pounding fists and the quiet work of his hands, the crowd began to sense what the bikers could not yet admit, that the man they mocked was not standing down, but holding something far stronger than anger, something they would not understand until it was too late. The sound of the fist against the wooden stall still lingered in the ears of those watching, but it was a silence that followed that pressed hardest on the square. The farmer had endured jeers about his limp, his clothes, his age, and even the insult of his work being scattered across the cobblestones. He admitted all with the same quiet steadiness, his hands arranging, lifting, cleaning, never once offering the satisfaction of anger. The bikers had grown louder, desperate to draw something from him, but all they had received was silence. Then, at last, he lifted his head. It was not sudden, not dramatic. There was no snap of defiance or flash of rage. It was simply a pause in his work, a hand resting briefly on the edge of a basket. And then his eyes rose from the table to meet the one who had called him a coward. The movement was so ordinary that for a moment no one noticed. But when his gaze settled, the air shifted. His eyes were not blazing or fierce. They were steady, calm, unreadable. They did not plead, nor did they challenge. They simply looked, as though weighing the man before him with a patience that ran deeper than years. It was the kind of gaze that belonged to someone who had seen more than most men could imagine, the kind of gaze that measured not just a moment, but the heart behind it. The laughter faltered. The biker who had pounded the table stiffened, his sneer flickering for the briefest second into something closer to uncertainty. He had expected fire, words, maybe even fear. What he found instead was a gaze that did not move, did not flinch, did not waver. It was the kind of gaze that made noise feel small. The others felt it too, though they tried to cover it. Their chuckles were forced now, breaking unevenly in the heavy air. One of them muttered something under his breath, but his voice lacked conviction. The market, so tense only moments before, grew even quieter. Mothers hushed their children. Vendors stilled their hands. The sheriff's brow furrowed beneath the brim of his hat. The boy at the honey stall clutched the edge of his table, whispering to himself without realizing he's looking at him. For that single moment, it was as if the farmer saw not just a man in front of him, but everything behind him, as though the years of bravado and cruelty were laid bare. The biker tried to hold the gaze, forcing his grin back onto his face, but the weight of it was difficult to bear. His laughter, once booming, now sounded thin, cracked around the edges. The farmer did not speak. He only looked, steady and still, and then, as if the moment had never happened, lowered his eyes once more to his work. His hands resumed their rhythm, placing vegetables with the same care as before, the silence returning as though unbroken. But the square knew something had shifted. The bikers might have still stood tall, their jackets heavy with patches and their boots loud on the cobblestones, but the old man's gaze had unsettled something in them. The laughter they had carried into the market was weaker now, and the crowd, once cautious, began to sense there was far more to the farmer than the patched jacket and the limp. The boy had not moved from his place behind the honey stall, though his mother had told him more than once to mind his work. His eyes stayed fixed on the far corner of the square where the farmer stood, his hands arranging produce, as if nothing unusual had happened. The bikers were still there, their laughter thinner now, forced into bursts that did not carry the same confidence as before. The boy had watched the man endure every insult without a word. He had seen the crate knocked over, the apples rolling into the dust, and then watched as the farmer calmly reclaimed every one. But it was a look, the brief, steady gaze, that unsettled him most. He had never seen silence speak that loudly. He leaned closer to his mother, who was tying a paper bag closed with twine. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the murmur of the crowd. Who is he really? Her hand still for just a second, the twine caught between her fingers. She didn't look at him. Instead, she pulled the knot tight, handed the bag to a waiting customer, and offered a polite smile. Only when the woman walked away did she glance down at her son, her eyes sharp with caution. "Don't ask questions you don't need answers to," she whispered. But the boy couldn't let it go. He had lived in Stonefield his whole life. He knew the rhythms of the town, the names of the shopkeepers, the stories behind nearly every face he saw on market days. The farmer had always been there, quiet, reliable, never more than a nod or a soft thank you when coins changed hands. He was a fixture of the square, like the fountain or the church bell. And yet, after this morning, the boy realized he didn't know a single true thing about him. Not where he came from, not what he did before, not even why his silence felt heavier than the bikers shouting. He pressed again, softer this time. "You know something. Everyone does. Who is he?" His mother's jaw tightened. She busied herself with stacking jars, her back turned slightly toward him as though distance could erase the question. Around them, other vendors traded the same glances. The shopkeeper who had spoken the warning stood in his doorway still, his arms crossed, his eyes on the farmer. The sheriff hadn't moved, but his posture was different now. No longer the lazy lean of someone watching a routine morning, but the measured stance of a man waiting. It was clear to the boy that more than one person knew, but none of them intended to say it aloud. The boy felt frustration rise in his chest. The bikers were still jeering, though with less bite, tried to shake off the weight of the silence they couldn't break. He wanted to shout the question across the square himself, to demand the answer no one would give, but he didn't. He bit his tongue and stood still, his hands tightening around the wooden edge of the stall. His mother's warning was clear enough. This was not the time to dig for truths. Still, the question lodged itself in his mind and refused to leave. He could not stop watching the farmer, could not stop wondering how a man who looked so ordinary could make others falter with nothing more than a glance. And though no one spoke the answer that morning, the boy knew it was only a matter of time before silence gave way to revelation. The sheriff had been standing near his truck for most of the morning, arms crossed, hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the pale autumn sun. He had watched the bikers roll in with their noise and swagger, seeing the way the square shifted uneasily beneath their presence. He had stayed back at first, the way small-town sheriffs often do, weighing whether stepping in too soon would spark more trouble than it solved. But as the laughter dragged on, as the insults grew sharper, and as the farmer's silence seemed only to inflame their frustration, he knew he couldn't remain on the edge forever. He pushed himself upright and began walking toward the stall. His boots struck the cobblestones with a steady rhythm, each step drawing the eyes of the vendors who had been holding their breath. Conversations faltered again. Mothers pulled children closer. The boy at the honey stall nudged his mother, whispering, "He's finally going." Even the florist stilled her hands, the ribbon she had been tying dangling loosely from her fingers. The sheriff wasn't a tall man, nor particularly imposing. His strength came from a presence built over years in the community, from the respect that came with knowing nearly every name and every story. He didn't shout as he approached. He simply cleared his throat and set his hand on the edge of the farmer's stall, not on his weapon, not on the bikers, but on the wood that had already borne the weight of fists. "That's enough," he said, his voice calm but carrying. "This market isn't a place of games." The bikers turned to him, smirks tugging at their mouths. One leaned back on his heels, arms spread in mock surrender. "Games?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "We're just having a little fun. Don't see the harm in that." Another snorted, flicking ash from his cigarette onto the cobblestones. "Sheriff, you worried this old man can't handle a little teasing? He's tougher than he looks. Just ask him." Their laughter rose again, though thinner now, forcing the sheriff's presence. He let it wash over him without reaction. His eyes, steady beneath the brim of his hat, moved from one face to the next before settling briefly on the farmer. The old man didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the sheriff's arrival, his hands still moving over the produce with that same deliberate care. It was as if he trusted the lawman to do what needed doing, or as if he knew the lawman's words would change nothing. The sheriff exhaled slowly, shifting his stance. "You've made your point," he said evenly. "Now it's time to move along." His tone carried no threat, only the way of authority used countless times in smaller disputes. Drunks at the tavern, neighbors squabbling over fences, boys fighting behind the schoolhouse. But this was different, and the bikers knew it. One of them stepped forward, his leather jacket creaking as he leaned close. "Move along," he repeated, mockery in every syllable. "You think you can tell us where to go? We'll leave when we're ready." The words were punctuated by another shove at the edge of the stall, not enough to topple it, but enough to show defiance. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he did not rise to the bait. His hand hovered briefly near his belt, then dropped again. He knew the risk of pushing too hard. A wrong word here, and the morning could erupt into something the town would remember for all the wrong reasons. The bikers dismissed him with laughter that was louder than before, deliberately so. Their backs turned halfway toward him as though he were no more than an inconvenience. They had measured his restraint, tested his authority, and decided to ignore it. Yet beneath their bravado, something had shifted. They could laugh at the sheriff, but the way of the farmer's silence still unsettled them, and no dismissal could erase it. The sheriff lingered for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. Then, with a small nod to the farmer that went unanswered, he stepped back. His presence had not ended the confrontation, but had drawn a line, and everyone watching knew that line would not hold forever. She had been quiet beside him all morning, her hand steady as she arranged bread, her presence a mirror of his calm. But when the sheriff's words failed to move the bikers, when their laughter rose again as though nothing had been said, she felt something not tight in her chest. Her eyes scanned the square. The children held close by worried mothers, the vendors who busied their hands to avoid staring, the boy at the honey stall who leaned forward with fear and curiosity, both written across his face. She saw the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone, but most of all on her father, leaning close so only he could hear. She let her voice slip low. "Papa," she whispered, her tone tight. "Let's just go? We don't need this." Her hand brushed his arm, not tugging, just a touch, a plea wrapped in quiet urgency. He didn't look at her right away. He placed another loaf of bread on the table, adjusted it so it sat squarely beside the vegetables, and only then turned his head slightly. His eyes met hers, calm as ever, lined by years but unshaken. He gave the smallest shake of his head. She swallowed hard, glancing at the bikers who leaned close, smirking, one of them flicking ash from his cigarette onto the cobblestones. "They're not going to stop," she murmured. "Why stay here and take this?" Her voice cracked faintly, not from fear alone, but from frustration of watching him refuse to defend himself in the way she thought he should. Her father's gaze held hers for a moment longer, then dropped back to the stall. He adjusted a basket of apples, lifted one that had bruised in the earlier fall, turned it over in his palm, and set it gently at the back of the row. His silence was his answer, as it had always been. She clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to push harder. She remembered the years of him never explaining, never offering more than necessary. Even as a child, when neighbors whispered about his limp or asked where he had been before the farm, he would only smile faintly, his silence as firm as a wall. She had accepted it then, but now it burned. "You don't have to prove anything," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Please, just leave with me." He set his hand briefly on hers, rough with calluses, steady and warm. It was not an embrace, not even reassurance. It was a grounding touch, a reminder that he had chosen this place and this moment. He released her hand and reached for another apple, polishing it slowly against his sleeve before setting it in place. She turned her head away, her throat tight, blinking hard as though the sting in her eyes was from the smoke drifting in the air. The bikers saw her whispering, saw her father's silence, and laughed all the louder, convinced they had forced shame upon them. But the old man's shoulders remained straight, his hands unshaken, his presence unmoved. The crowd saw it too. The vendors, the sheriff, the boy at the honey stall. All of them understood that the farmer was not staying out of stubbornness or pride. He was standing firm because walking away meant giving something up, something only he seemed to understand fully. His daughter, though frustrated, could not pull him from it, so she stayed beside him, her jaw tight, her hands busy, following his lead even as her heart urged her to run. She didn't know why he stood so firm, why he endured so much in silence, but she trusted him enough to stay. And in the space between her plea and his refusal, the market itself seemed to brace for what would come next. The bikers had grown restless. Their laughter had carried them through spilled apples, through jeers and fists pounding on wood. But now it began to thin, stretched too far over silence that refused to break. They shifted closer, the circle tightening around the stall, as if crowding him would finally force a reaction. Their boots scuffed against cobblestones, their smoke drifted heavy in the air, and still the farmer kept his calm rhythm, placing bread and produce as though the square had never changed. His daughter stood beside him, shoulders tight, hands busy but trembling faintly. She tried to follow his example, to let her silence match his. But the strain showed. The bikers noticed. One of them, broad across the chest, his grin sharp and unkind, leaned toward her. His eyes lingered too long, and when she turned slightly to set a loaf down, he reached out and caught her wrist. The movement was casual in its cruelty, his hand closing around her arm as if testing the weight of defiance. "What's the matter?" he drawled, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Don't like us admiring the family business?" His grip tightened, his thumb pressing into her skin. The other bikers laughed, the sound jagged, filling the square with something that no longer resembled humor. Her breath caught, her body twisting instinctively to pull away. Her eyes darted to her father, panic flashing through them, though she bit back the cry that rose in her throat. For the first time all morning, the calm at the stall fractured, not in his hands, not in his silence, but in the grip that threatened what he had stood to protect. It happened so fast that most in the crowd only realized after it was done. The farmer's hand shot out, not hesitant, not slow with age, but lightning fast. His fingers closed around the biker's wrist, his grip precise, unyielding. With a simple turn, a motion sharp and efficient, the hold was broken. The biker's hand sprang open as if released by a force greater than his will, and he stumbled back half a step, his grin vanishing into shock. The daughter's arm was free. She stepped back quickly, rubbing her wrist, her breast shaking, but her father's hand did not linger on her. He had already returned to stillness, his arm lowering slowly, his body settling again behind the stall as though the action had been no more than setting an apple into place. The crowd gasped, a ripple of sound spreading to the vendors and townsfolk who had been frozen in their unease. The sheriff's eyes sharpened, recognition flickering across his face. The boy at the honey stall whispered to his mother, "Did you see that?" His voice filled with awe. The shopkeeper in the doorway gave the faintest nod, as though the moment confirmed something he had already known. The biker cradled his wrist, his face twisting with anger that was laced now with confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The ease with which the old man had broken his grip unsettled him more than any insult could have. His friend tried to laugh it off, voices loud and brash, but the sound cracked at the edges. The farmer said nothing. His eyes lowered once more, his hand steady as he reached for the next task at his stall. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the lightning-fast movement had been nothing more than another part of the rhythm of his day. But everyone watching knew different. The silence that followed was no longer just a quiet of restraint. It was the silence of a man who had revealed, in the smallest motion, that he was not what he seemed. The square seemed to stop breathing. The noise that had filled it all morning, boots scraping, coins clinking, laughter rising too loudly, collapsed into stillness. For a heartbeat, even the wind seemed to withdraw, leaving only the faint creak of wood as the farmer's hand returned to rest on the stall. The daughter stood a step back, rubbing her wrist, her face pale but her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and awe. Across from her, the biker who had grabbed her arm stared down at his own hand, as though it no longer belonged to him, flexing his fingers, his mouth open but empty of sound. The other bikers blinked, shifting uneasily. They had seen the movement, but couldn't name it. It had happened too quickly, too precise to be brushed off as chance. One moment their companion had held the woman's wrist. The next he was stumbling back, his grip broken as if snapped apart by an invisible force. They looked at one another, searching for explanation, but found only the same flicker of uncertainty mirrored in each other's faces. The onlookers remained frozen as well. Mothers with children clutched their little ones tighter, though their fear was no longer aimed at the bikers alone. Vendors who had been pretending to mind their business now stared openly, their hands still on scales and baskets, as though pausing might let them hold onto what they had witnessed. The boy at the honey stall had leaned so far forward, he was nearly spilling jars, his breath caught in his throat, whispering, "Did you see that?" to no one in particular. The sheriff's posture shifted at last, his arms no longer crossed, but hanging loose at his sides, his eyes locked on the farmer. His jaw tightened, not with anger but with recognition. He had seen men move like that before, years ago, in places far from the quiet market of Stonefield. The old shopkeeper in the doorway didn't move either, but the faint nod he gave confirmed what his earlier warning had suggested. The biker who had been disarmed shook his head as though to clear it, his pride battling with the sting of what had just happened. He tried to summon a sneer, but it faltered. His companions attempted laughter, but the sound rang thin, brittle, like glass about to crack. The square absorbed the effort and gave nothing back. The farmer, for his part, resumed his work as if nothing had changed. He lifted another apple, polished it against the sleeve, and set it in line with the others. His silence pressed against the stunned crowd like a weight, steady and unbroken. He didn't look at the biker whose grip he had broken. He didn't acknowledge the gasps or the whispers. He simply kept moving, each action measured, controlled, as though restoring order was his only task. That restraint unsettled the bikers more than the sudden movement had. A fight, they could have understood. Shouts, curses, anger, that was familiar ground. But the calm afterward, the ease with which he returned his produce, stripped him of footing. It suggested not accident, not luck, but something practiced, honed long before this morning. The silence deepened, stretching long enough that even the children sensed it, wide-eyed and unblinking. The square waited breathless for what would come next, and though no words had been spoken, everyone knew that nothing about the market was ordinary anymore. The bikers had pushed too far, and in a single motion the old farmer had shown that their noise meant nothing against his quiet strength. The silence stretched across the square until it felt as though the entire town held its breath. The farmer's hands moved with their same deliberate rhythm, polishing an apple, setting it back in line, brushing dust from the edge of the stall. But then, without looking up, he let his voice cut into the air. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words carried clearly, each syllable flat and unshaken. "Don't touch her again." The tone was calm, even the kind of voice a man used when giving an instruction he expected to be followed. No threat laced it, no rise of anger, only certainty. The square absorbed the words and held them, as though the cobblestones themselves recognized the weight in them. The biker who had grabbed the daughter's wrist froze where he stood. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He had been ready for a fight, for shouting, maybe even blows, but not for this. The quietness unsettled him more than any threat could have. His hand twitched at his side, flexing as if to prove to himself that he still had control. But the memory of how easily it had been broken lingered in his bones. The other bikers shifted, their bravado faltering. One forced a laugh, though it came out too harsh, too brittle. Another muttered something about old man nerves, but his eyes darted toward the sheriff, who had taken a slow step forward. The lawman's face betrayed no expression, but his stance spoke volumes. He had heard the warning too, and unlike the bikers, he knew exactly what it meant. The daughter stood close to her father, her wrist still tingling where the grip had been. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and astonishment. For all the years she had known him, she could count on one hand the number of times he had spoken in public more than a few words. To hear him now, to hear the tone that left no room for defiance, was to glimpse a part of him she had only ever guessed at. She did not speak, but she stood straighter, her own silence reinforcing his. The crowd had not expected words either. Vendors and shoppers who had been frozen in their unease leaned forward slightly, as though catching a glimpse of something rare and dangerous. The boy at the honey stall whispered to his mother. He finally talked, but she hushed him quickly, her eyes never leaving the farmer. The biker swallowed, his throat working against pride and uncertainty. He wanted to laugh it off, to sneer, to call the man weak again, but the word stuck. The calmness and that single warning stripped him of every excuse. The farmer hadn't threatened to fight. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply drawn a line with the kind of authority that didn't come from noise or bravado, but from a place far deeper, forged long before this morning. For a long moment, no one moved. The farmer went back to his work, his hands steady as ever, but the line he had spoken remained in the air, immovable. The market seemed to bend around it, every onlooker aware that the laughter of the bikers had been broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. The silence was no longer his shield. Now it was his weapon. The words hung in the air long after they were spoken, clinging to the square like the smell of smoke. The farmer had not shouted, had not raised his hand, had not let anger color his tone. Yet his calm warning had unsettled something in the bikers that their noise could not cover. For a moment, the stillness weighed heavier than their engines ever had. But pride is not so easily undone. One of them, the same man who had grabbed the daughter's wrist, shook his head and forced a laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Farmer's strength," he said loudly, as though naming it could make sense of what had just happened. "Man's got calluses from hauling pumpkins, that's all." He slapped the shoulder of the one nearest him, his voice rising in volume. "Don't tell me you boys are scared of a scarecrow with a limp." The others caught on, their laughter growing again, louder than before, deliberately filling the silence. They shoved each other, pointed at the patched flannel, the scuffed boots, the weathered face. "Bet he spends more time talking to his cows than people," one said. "Look at him. Can't even stand straight, but he thinks he's tough." The laughter rose like a wave, exaggerated and sharp, bouncing against the shop fronts until it almost drowned out the steady rhythm of the market. Some of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably, the spell of the warning broken by the noise. A few let out nervous chuckles, the kind that come when people try to blend into the crowd, to avoid being noticed. But most remained silent, eyes darting between the bikers and the man they mocked. They could feel the desperation and the laughter, the way it strained to cover something none of the bikers wanted to admit. The farmer did not respond. He picked up another apple, polished it against his sleeve, and set it gently back in line. His silence seemed to absorb the noise, each calm motion reducing their words to something hollow. His daughter stood close by, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the men who laughed as if volume alone could restore their confidence. The sheriff remained at the edge of the square, his arms folded again, though his gaze never left the farmer. He had heard laughter like this before, years ago, in bars and barracks, where men laughed loudest when they were most afraid. The shopkeeper in the doorway shook his head faintly, a soundless comment that the crowd understood but the bikers ignored. The boy at the honey stall whispered again, though this time his words carried or rather than fear. "They don't get it," he said. His mother shushed him quickly, her hands trembling as she stacked jars. The bikers laughed on, but cracks showed through. Their voices overlapped too much. Their words tripped over each other. Their eyes flickered a man who worked as though none of it touched him. They mocked his limp, his jacket, his age, calling him scarecrow, calling him farmer, but every word fell flat against his steady calm. It became clear to everyone watching that their noise was not strength but cover. They had seen something they could not explain, and their laughter was the only weapon they had left. Yet even as it filled the square, it no longer held power. The old man's silence and the single warning he had spoken had already shifted the ground beneath their feet. The noise of the bikers was still spilling across the square, their laughter sharper now, louder than it had been before, like men determined to convince themselves they hadn't been shaken. They mocked his boots, his limp, the patched elbows of his flannel, repeating the same insults again and again, louder each time. But the weight of the morning had already shifted, and though their voices filled the air, the crowd could feel the hollowness underneath. It was then, through the edge of the market, that a new sound entered, boots, polished and firm, striking cobblestones a rhythm that was not hurried but carried its own kind of authority. Heads turned first, then voices hushed, as a man in uniform walked into the square. He was not young, his hair cut close and flecked with gray, but his stride held the ease of someone still built by discipline. His jacket bore patches and insignia the townsfolk did not recognize, but one glance told him he was not simply a passerby. He carried a small grocery bag in one hand, as though he had come only to collect something simple and leave again. But when his eyes found the stall at the far corner, when they settled on the old farmer standing silently behind his produce, his steps faltered. For a moment his face softened, not with confusion but with recognition. He stopped, straightened, and stared at the man who had been mocked all morning. "Commander Holt?" The words cut through the square like a bell. His voice carried not just surprise but respect, a weight that turned every head and silenced even the biker's mid-laugh. The farmer did not answer right away. He set down the apple in his hand, dusted it gently against his sleeve, and placed it with the others. Only then did he raise his eyes toward the man in uniform. Their gazes met, and for the first time that morning, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition, the faintest nod, the kind of acknowledgement shared between men who had once walked the same ground far from here. The bikers glanced at one another, their grins faltering. "Commander?" The word hung in the air, foreign in a market of bread and vegetables, but spoken with such certainty that it carried a truth none could dismiss. The onlookers murmured, whispers moving quickly through the crowd. The boy at the honey stall tugged at his mother's sleeve, eyes wide. "Commander?" he asked, but she had no answer. The man in uniform stepped closer, his posture straighter now, his voice carrying clearly. "Sir, I'll be damned. I didn't think I'd ever see you here. After everything. After Coronado, after Ramadi," he trailed off, shaking his head, a quiet smile spreading over his face. "You always said you'd find peace in the dirt. And here you are." The farmer gave the faintest smile, but no words followed. His silence remained, steady as it had been all morning, though now it carried new meaning. The daughter stood still, her hands frozen in place, her eyes wide with questions she had never dared to ask. The bikers tried to laugh again, but their voices cracked. One muttered, "What's this supposed to mean?" But no one answered. The uniform spoke louder than mockery ever could, and the title had already undone their bravado. The man in uniform set his grocery bag down and extended a hand across the stall. The farmer's own hand, callous and strong, met it firmly. No words were needed. The crowd, the sheriff, even the bikers understood now that the silence of the old man was not weakness at all. It was the quiet of someone who had carried things greater than the noise of men trying to prove themselves. The words seemed to echo long after they were spoken. Commander Holt. They carried across the market with a clarity that no amount of laughter or jeering could erase. The sound of them reached every corner of the square, touching the ears of vendors who had pretended to focus on their wares, of parents who had kept their children close, of the sheriff who had stood measured and waiting, and even of the bikers whose noise had filled the morning. The market shifted instantly. Whispers rippled through the crowd, disbelief and recognition mingling in hurried voices. The boy at the honey stall tugged again at his mother's sleeve, eyes round as he whispered, "Commander?" She only pressed a hand to his shoulder, her lips parting but no words coming. The florist froze with scissors in her hand, her bouquet unfinished. The baker leaned half out his doorway, his apron dusted with flour, staring as if he were seeing a stranger where a neighbor had always stood. The bikers, who had been leaning on noise to cover their unease, blinked in unison. Their grins faltered, and for the first time, none of them reached for a fresh insult. One of them scoffed, trying to dismiss the name with a shake of his head, but his voice cracked when he muttered, "That's just some farmer." The certainty he tried to project never reached his eyes. The man in uniform did not back down. His stance was firm, his voice steady, carrying the respect of someone who had served under that very name. "Commander Holt," he repeated, this time not as a question but as a statement. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect, the kind of acknowledgement given by soldiers to those who had once led them through places no civilian could imagine. The farmer, Commander Holt, met the gaze with the same quiet he had carried all morning. He gave a small nod, neither confirming nor denying, but the weight of his silence was enough. Everyone watching understood, now that the name was true, the years of his silence, the patience of his hands, the calm that had endured every insult. All of it was recast in that instant. He was not just a man with a limp and patched flannel. He was someone who had once commanded in places of violence and chaos, someone who had returned to soil and seed not because he was weak, but because he had already given enough of himself elsewhere. The sheriff's expression shifted too, recognition flashing in his eyes, though he said nothing. The older shopkeeper in the doorway nodded faintly, as though the confirmation was no surprise to him at all. The daughter, standing close to her father, felt her breath catch. She had known he carried things he never spoke of, had sensed in the way he endured hardship without complaint. But hearing his name, spoken with reverence in front of the entire town, confirmed what she had only guessed at. The bikers shuffled where they stood, their bravado cracked. One muttered, "Commander of what?" though the answer was already in the silence that followed. The crowd knew, or at least imagined enough to understand, that whatever he had once been, it was more than enough to put men like these in their place. The square held its silence, heavy and stunned, as the weight of a hidden past settled over it. The farmer returned his attention to the produce, his hands steady, his shoulders straight. He had never needed to speak of who he was. The name had spoken for him, and nothing more was required. For a few moments, the market held its stunned silence. The name had landed with a weight that bent the air, but the bikers, desperate to recover their footing, burst out in scoffs and half-laughter. One of them barked, "Commander?" "Him." His voice was too loud, too forced, a cover for the unease that had begun to crawl under their skin. Another slapped his knee, shaking his head. "Don't tell me the scarecrow runs the Navy now. Look at him. He can barely stand straight." Their laughter rose again, but was jagged, hollow, lacking the easy swagger they tried to maintain all morning. The man in uniform didn't smile. He didn't flinch. His gaze stayed on the farmer, then shifted to men who mocked him. "It's not a joke," he said evenly. His voice carried authority, the kind that had been drilled into him through years of discipline. "That man is Commander Nathan Holt. "Retired Navy SEAL." The words rang sharp and the crowd stirred. Whispers swept the square like wind through dry leaves. The boy at the honey stall repeated the words under his breath, tasting them as though they belonged to a story too big for the quiet market. His mother shushed him again, but her own eyes were fixed on the farmer with a mixture of fear and awe. The bikers laughed again, though it was strained. "Seal? You mean like the animals that clap for fish?" One of them said, trying to drag his friends back into laughter. But the joke fell flat. The uniformed man's stare didn't waver. He stepped closer, his boots striking the cobblestones with deliberate weight. "I served under him," he said firmly. "Coronado, Ramadi, Kabul. Missions most of you couldn't spell, let alone survive. He commanded men in the worst places on earth. He led us through fire when no one else could." His words cut into the square, louder than the laughter that tried to cover them. "The only reason I'm alive today is because of him." The bikers blinked, their grins faltering again. They exchanged glances, the bravado they had worn like armor beginning to crack. They wanted to deny it, to keep scoffing, but the man in uniform spoke with too much conviction, too much detail for it to be a tale invented on the spot. His voice carried the weight of memory, and anyone listening could hear it. The sheriff's jaw tightened at the confirmation, his silence saying more than words could. The shopkeeper in the doorway gave another faint nod, as though everything he had warned earlier was now made plain. The townsfolk leaned closer, whispering, their unease shifting into something else, respect, even pride, hidden beneath their stunned faces. The farmer himself remained still, his eyes lowered to his work. He hadn't asked for his name to be spoken aloud, hadn't tried to claim anything of his past. His silence continued, calm and steady, while the truth of who he was rippled through the square. The bikers tried one last time to laugh it off, their voices too loud, too quick. But the crowd no longer believed them. The truth stood there in plain sight. The man they had mocked all morning was no ordinary farmer. He was a man who had once commanded warriors, a man whose silence was not weakness, but strength honed in places beyond their comprehension. The market had always thrived on talk, prices of crops, rumors about weather, whispers of neighbors' lives. But that morning, talk shifted, carrying one name and one truth from stall to stall until every ear had heard it. Commander Holt, retired Navy SEAL. The man who had stood silent through jeers and insults was not only a farmer with weathered boots and patched flannel, but a soldier once decorated for leading missions far from this quiet Vermont town. It began with the boy at the honey stall. His mother tried to hush him, but his voice carried anyway, repeating the words he had overheard. "Navy SEAL," he said, the syllable sharp with awe. A florist nearby caught it and passed it on under her breath, her eyes never leaving the farmer's stall. The baker, leaning out his doorway, muttered it to a customer who had paused mid-purchase, their coins clutch forgotten in hand. Soon it was everywhere, spoken in hushed tones, but with a weight that only grew heavier with each repetition. The sheriff, who had known more than he let on, remained still, though his silence now had the feel of confirmation. He didn't need to explain. The set of his jaw and the flicker in his eyes told anyone watching that he had long suspected the truth. The older shopkeeper, who had issued the warning earlier, stood straighter in his doorway, his arms still crossed, his expression unreadable. He had known enough to tell the bikers to be careful, and now his words returned like an echo, vindicated by revelation. The bikers shifted uneasily, their laughter stripped of conviction. They had mocked his limp, his patched jacket, the deep lines in his face. They had seen only a man who looked broken down by age and work. Now those same signs stood in a new light. The limp not a weakness, but of wounds carried home. The patched jacket, not a mark of poverty, but a man who no longer needed the trappings of pride. The silence not cowardice, but control born from years of training. The uniformed man, who had spoken his name, did not waver. He added no flourish, no stories of battle, only a firm voice that carried truth. He was decorated. He told anyone near enough to listen, led missions that never made the papers. Men followed him because they trusted him with their lives. He saved mine. His eyes flicked toward the bikers, their bravado thin as paper. And you stand here laughing at him. The farmer gave no acknowledgement, no nod, no denial. He continued setting out his produce with the same steady rhythm, as though the revelation were nothing more than another whisper of the wind. His daughter stood beside him, her hands still, her eyes filled with questions that had lived there for years, and now pressed even harder against the silence he kept. She had heard stories growing up, fragments from others, hints that her father had carried something more than the soil. Now those fragments had shape, spoken aloud in front of the entire town. The market itself seemed to shift around him. Respect rose quietly from the crowd, layered with surprise and guilt that they had never asked more about the man who had stood among them all these years. The bikers, who had come with engines roaring and voices loud, found themselves dwarfed by something they couldn't touch. They could laugh at Flannel and Limp, but they couldn't laugh away a past that commanded silence stronger than theirs ever could. The name spread, the truth deepened, and the market, once filled with jeers, now carried the weight of a man revealed. He had never asked for recognition, never spoken of medals or missions, but now the town saw him not as scarecrow, not as farmer, but as what he had always been, a man who had given more of himself than any of them had known. The crowd had grown hushed, the name echoing through the square until it seemed to rest on every tongue. People who had known him for years as nothing more than the quiet farmer with crates of apples and potatoes now stared as though they were seeing him for the first time. The bikers shifted, their swagger crumbling, trying to shake off what had been spoken, but failing to find the noise to do so. The man in uniform stood firm, his respect undeniable, his words still hanging in the air. And in the midst of it, the farmer himself continued as he always had, arranging produce, dusting soil from vegetables, polishing an apple against his sleeve. It was his daughter who broke the silence this time. Her voice wasn't raised, wasn't sharp with anger the way it might have been earlier. It came soft, steady, but carrying enough weight to reach the ears of those closest, and then beyond as the market quieted to hear her. He never brags about it, she said, her eyes fixed on her father. He just came home to grow food. The words startled even her as she spoke them, but they were true in a way that needed no rehearsal. She thought of the morning she had watched him rise before the sun, limping through the fields, carrying feed and water, coaxing life from the soil without complaint. She thought of the times when neighbors had whispered, when children had asked about his limp, when others had speculated in hushed voices about his past. He had answered none of it, never offering stories, never hanging medals on walls, never once reminding anyone of what he had done. His pride was in the earth, in the harvest, in setting food on the table for others. Her voice carried further than she expected. The boy at the honey stall turned to his mother, repeating her words in a whisper as though committing them to memory. The florist lowered her scissors, eyes damp. The baker in his doorway nodded once, his lips pressed tight. The sheriff, who had known enough to keep his silence, let the smallest flicker of respect cross his expression. The bikers heard her too. One tried to laugh, muttering, "So what? He's just a farmer now." But the sound was weak. Her words stripped their mockery of its force. They had tried all morning to frame his silence as weakness, his work as small. Now it was clear that the very things they mocked were the proof of his strength. He had chosen the field over the battlefield, the soil over the spotlight, not because he had nothing else, but because he had already given more than most ever would. The farmer did not acknowledge her words with a nod or a glance. He simply kept working, the way he always did, letting silence be his answer. But for his daughter, saying it aloud was enough. She straightened, her hand brushing the crate nearest her, her pride no longer hidden behind clenched jaw and quiet restraint. She had lived in the shadow of unspoken history, and now, for the first time, she let herself speak it. The crowd absorbed the truth of her words, carrying them alongside the name that had already reshaped the morning. Commander Holt, retired Navy SEAL, a man who had never boasted, never demanded recognition, never sought more than the peace of his land. The daughter's voice had given form to what everyone now saw, that his silence had never been emptiness, but choice. The words from the daughter had carried through the square with a clarity the bikers could not laugh away. For all their noise, for all the posturing and mockery, her voice had sliced through the morning with something truer than anything they had said. He never bragged about it. He just came home to grow food. The market absorbed the truth and held it, and suddenly the gang's laughter no longer rang out as it once had. They shifted on their feet, the swagger that had carried them into the square, now weighed down by uncertainty. One adjusted the collar of his jacket. Another glanced briefly toward the sheriff before turning away. Their arms folded, not in confidence, but to hide the twitch of unease creeping into their hands. Even their boots, one stomping heavily on the cobblestones, now seemed to shuffle, hesitant to command space they no longer owned. They tried to recover with words, their voices lowered but still searching for strength. "So, what if he's got a title?" one muttered, his tone pitched more for his companions in the crowd. That was years ago. Look at him now, just another man selling apples. His attempt at mockery lacked the bite of before. It drifted weakly into the air, met not with laughter but with silence that grew heavier with each passing second. Another cleared his throat, forcing out, "Stories, that's all. People love stories. Doesn't mean they're true." But even as he said it, his eyes darted to the uniformed man standing tall in the square, the grocery bag forgotten at his feet. The soldier's expression was steady, unwavering, and it robbed the denial of its power. The biker's bravado cracked further. The crowd had changed too. Where once they had looked away, hesitant to meet the eyes of the men in leather, now their gazes lingered openly. Vendors stood straighter. Customers pressed close to stalls, but no longer out of fear. Respect shifted toward the farmer, subtle but undeniable, and the bikers felt it pressing in on them from every side. Their voices grew softer still, turning to mutters shared only among themselves. "He's just old. Don't mean nothing now. We could take him if we wanted." But each time they said it, their tone betrayed the truth. They weren't certain anymore. The farmer's silence had outlasted their taunts, and the single warning he had spoken carried more weight than all their noise combined. The revelation of his past had stripped away their illusion of control. The farmer didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He continued his quiet work. Steady as ever, his presence the very thing that unsettled them most. His calm made their hesitation more obvious, their bravado more hollow. His daughter stood close, her shoulders squared now with a quiet pride she no longer tried to hide. The uniformed man remained nearby, his silence as sharp as a blade, reminding them that every word spoken about Commander Holt was truth. The biker's stance broke further. Arms that had been crossed now dropped loosely at their sides. Feet that stood firm now shifted backward an inch at a time. Their noise, once meant to dominate the square, was gone, replaced by voices too low, too uncertain, to hold power. And the market, once their stage, had turned against them completely. The bikers' voices had dwindled to mutters, their laughter gone, their postures fraying at the edges. They had filled the morning with noise, but now the silence of the crowd pressed heavier than any words could. It was in that silence that the sheriff moved. He had lingered near his truck long enough, watching, weighing, letting the scene play out as far as it could. But there came a point when truth needed to be spoken plainly, and the market had reached that point. He pushed himself away from the hood of his truck and walked slowly across the cobblestones. Each step was measured, the kind of stride that carried authority without rushing. The crowd parted slightly as he passed, heads turning to follow him, whispers cutting short. Even the bikers, unsettled as they were, shifted their stance as he approached. His presence no longer seemed like a bystander's hesitation. It carried the weight of law and something more. When he stopped at the farmer's stall, he let his eyes move from the overturned crates to the patched flannel to the daughter standing protectively nearby. Finally, his gaze fixed on the man who had been mocked, and then turned to the bikers. His voice came steady, loud enough for every ear in the square to hear. "That man's done more for this country than you ever will." The words hit harder than a fist. They landed with finality, not open to debate, not wrapped in suggestion. The crowd reacted instantly. A ripple of nods, a few murmured agreements, a collective release of breath, as if someone had finally said aloud what the silence had already been shouting. The boy at the honey stall repeated it under his breath, all sharpening every syllable. His mother looked at him, but she did not hush him this time. The bikers stiffened. Some tried to hold their smirks, but their eyes betrayed them. One of them opened his mouth, ready to deflect with another joke, but the sheriff's gaze stopped him cold. There was no mockery in the lawman's tone, only conviction. It was not the kind of respect spoken lightly. It was a verdict. The uniformed man, who had named the farmer earlier, gave a slow nod, affirming the sheriff's words. The shopkeeper in the doorway folded his arms tighter, his chin lifted, the weight of long-held knowledge confirmed. Even the florist, who had stood trembling all morning, let her hands fall still, her eyes fixed on the farmer with new understanding. The sheriff didn't elaborate. He didn't list battles or medals or missions. He didn't need to. His statement was enough. He spoke for the market, for the town, for every quiet witness who had stood uneasy while the bikers shouted. And in doing so, he stripped away the last of the gang's bravado. The farmer remained as he was, his hands still, his face calm. He gave no acknowledgement, no nod of agreement, no word confirm or deny. His silence held, steady and deliberate, but now it was framed by voices that carried the truth for him. He had never needed to defend himself. Others had done it for him, because he had already defended more than any of them ever could. The bikers, faced with the sheriff's certainty, found their noise gone, their boots no longer stamped, their laughter no longer rose. They stood in a square that no longer belonged to them, a square that now turned its weight behind a man they had called Scarecrow. And though the sheriff stepped back without another word, the echo of what he had said remained, heavier than the roar of their engines. The sheriff's words still hung in the air, their weight settling over the square until even the sound of the fountain seemed subdued. The bikers had nothing left to throw, their bravado cracked open for everyone to see. The crowd had shifted fully now, no longer shrinking from their noise, no longer uneasy. They stood straighter, their eyes fixed not on the gang but on the man behind the stall. It would have been the moment for most men to claim a kind of victory, to straighten with pride, to throw back words that would sting as deeply as those they had endured. But the farmer did none of that. He bent to lift another crate, his limp playing as he shifted the weight, and set it neatly on the table. His hands brushed the wood, steady, unshaken, as though nothing about the morning had been extraordinary. He reached for a burlap sack of potatoes, a knot of the twine with careful fingers, and began setting them out in even rows. Not a glance was given to the bikers. Not a word rose to the crowd. His silence was the same as it had been all along, his calm unbroken. His daughter watched him, her chest tight with the words she still wanted to speak. She wanted to call out the cruelty, to remind everyone what he had endured here. But when she looked at him, his face lined but composed, his movements careful but unhurried, she understood. His strength had never come from declaring what he had done or demanding recognition. It was in the quiet act of refusing to be moved by anything that sought to shake him. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to rise above anyone. He had already shown what he was by refusing to descend into their noise. The crowd felt it too. The shopkeeper in the doorway nodded faintly, as though the lesson had been taught without a single spoken word. The florist, who had trembled through the jeers, now stood still, her bouquet forgotten in her hands, her eyes fixed on a man who worked as though arranging potatoes was more important than defending himself. The boy at the honey stall leaned on the counter, his voice hushed with awe. "He just keeps going," he whispered, as though the simple act of setting out produce had become something extraordinary. The bikers shifted uneasily. Their laughter had dried up, their mutters fading into silence that no one was willing to break. They had expected anger, retaliation, even the sheriff's authority. But what they faced instead was harder to answer. The calm refusal of a man who did not acknowledge them at all. Every apple placed, every loaf adjusted, every potato set in line was a dismissal sharper than words could ever be. They had been made irrelevant by the very man they had tried to humiliate. The sheriff stepped back toward his truck, his role finished, though his eyes lingered on the farmer a moment longer. The man in uniform remained nearby, his stance respectful, saying nothing, because nothing more needed to be said. In the square, the noise of the market slowly returned. Coins clinked again, children's voices rose, vendors called softly to customers. Life resumed, though now it moved around a center that had changed. The farmer kept working as he always had, his restraint the final answer to everything that had been thrown at him. He gave them nothing but the calm he had carried all along, and in that calm he showed more than any speech or gloating ever could. The stall had always been his alone. Week after week, He arrived with crates and baskets, setting them out in his patient rhythm, never asking for help and never needing it. But after the morning's unraveling, the square no longer held itself at a distance. The first to move was the florist. She stepped away from her buckets of roses and lilies, walked across the cobblestones, and bent to gather 2 apples that had rolled under her table earlier. Without a word, she placed them back on a stall, her hands lingering for a moment before she returned to her stand. Others followed. The boy at the honey stall, ignoring his mother's quiet tug on his sleeve, picked up a sack of onions that had slumped to the side and straightened it neatly. He glanced up at the farmer with wide eyes, but the old man gave no acknowledgement, continuing with the calm work of arranging bread and vegetables. Still, the boy's small act had been seen, and soon it was no longer just his. The baker came next, flour still dusting his apron, carrying a fresh loaf from his shop. He sat beside the daughter's bread, murmuring, "On the house." He didn't wait for thanks, didn't explain himself, simply added to the table and returned to his doorway. A retired schoolteacher, who had been leaning on her cane near the fountain, shuffled forward to collect apples that had been left bruised in the dust. She didn't care if they were unsellable. She placed them back in the crate, wiped her hands on her skirt, and stood a little taller as she turned to face the square. The acts built quietly, one upon the other. A grocer carried over a basket of carrots that had rolled into his path. A mother sent her child to pick up a potato that had been kicked aside earlier. Coins clinked louder now as customers stepped forward, not hesitating as they filled their bags. One man overpaid without explanation, setting bills on the counter and walking away with only a handful of apples. Another paused long enough to nod to the farmer, the kind of nod given to a neighbor, but waited now with respect. The bikers saw it all, and the shift unsettled them more than silence ever had. Their laughter had lost its edge long before, but now it vanished entirely as the crowd's quiet solidarity grew. No one shouted, no one jeered back. The townsfolk simply stood with him, their presence steady, their support unspoken but undeniable. Each apple returned, each coin exchanged, each nod of acknowledgement pushed the mockery further out of the square. The sheriff watched from his truck, his arms folded again, but this time there was a faint ease in his stance. The man in uniform remained close, his eyes fixed on the farmer, a faint smile ghosting across his face as though he recognized the same strength he had once followed. The farmer did not change. He did not pause in his work, did not look up to accept the gestures. He continued as he always had, placing produce in careful rows, adjusting baskets, polishing apples against the sleeve. But for the first time in years, he was not alone at his stall. The town had stepped quietly into his silence, filling it not with noise but with presence. By the time the church bell rang the next hour, the square had shifted entirely. The bikers no longer owned the space with their noise. The market belonged once more to its people, and at its center stood the man they had mocked, now surrounded by a quiet solidarity stronger than any engine roar. Engines broke the stillness again, but not with the same confidence as when they had first roared into the square. The bikers moved slowly toward their machines, their boots dragging more than stomping, their voices hushed where laughter had once barked. A few muttered under their breath, trying to salvage pride with half-hearted scoffs, but the crowd didn't give them the attention they wanted. The market had turned its focus elsewhere, on the quiet stall where produce was once again lined in careful rows, where bread sat neatly beside apples, where the man they had mocked continued his work without acknowledging their retreat. One by one, the bikers swung their legs over their motorcycles, the creak of leather loud in the hush that held the square. Engines sputtered to life, their growl filling the air, but this time it carried no weight. The sound felt empty, stripped of the swagger that had accompanied it hours before. They revved louder, as though noise could reclaim what they had lost. But even the youngest children no longer flinched. The roar of their machines could not drown the silence of the man they had failed to shake. The sheriff remained by his truck, arms folded, his gaze steady. The shopkeeper leaned in his doorway, chin lifted faintly, watching them go. The florist stood with her hands still clasped, no longer trembling. The boy at the honey stall leaned forward, eyes fixed on the farmer, whispering to his mother, "They're leaving." His mother only nodded, her hand resting on his shoulder, her eyes never leaving the stall either. The bikers pulled out a square in a staggered line, their engines echoing off brick and glass. They didn't laugh now, didn't jeer or shout. Their noise was mechanical, not human, and the silence of the market pressed heavier than the sound of a dozen exhaust pipes. The crowd didn't jeer back, didn't gloat, didn't throw insults to follow them out. They simply stood, still and steady, letting the departure carry its own weight. At the edge of the square, one of the bikers, perhaps the youngest, perhaps the one least hardened by pride, glanced back. His eyes lingered on the stall, on the man who never looked up from his work. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest break in a mask of bravado. He gave the smallest nod, a gesture caught by only a few who watched closely. It was not apology, not surrender, but an acknowledgement, a recognition that they had tested something they didn't understand, and the answer they received was more than they had expected. The farmer didn't see it. Or, if he did, he gave no sign. His hands moved as they always had, polishing an apple, setting it in its row, adjusting the edge of a crate. His silence remained unbroken, calm and deliberate, stronger than any speech he could have given. For him, there was nothing to win, nothing to prove. The work was enough. When the last motorcycle disappeared down Main Street, the market exhaled. The hum of ordinary life returned slowly, coins exchanging, bread sold, flowers chosen. Yet beneath it all lingered the quiet respect that had settled in the square, heavier than before. The farmer had never asked for it, never spoken of what he had done, but that morning the town had seen it for themselves. His silence, steady and unshaken, had been louder than all the laughter that had tried to break it.